Sebastian, one of the great discoveries for me is that I'm not alone in my enthusiastic affection for Pico della Mirandola or Marcello Ficino. And indeed, I discovered from your book you named your dog after Pico. I don't feel alone in the universe anymore. This is wonderful.
Yes, well, discovering Pico as not my dog, the thinker, as an undergraduate was a sort of transforming experience in many ways. In that, um, I read those three famous works of his all together: the Oration on the Dignity of Man, the One and the Many, and the Heptapolis. And that's those texts um, really were those initial works that got me thinking about the Neoplatonic philosophy, um, and its recovery in the Renaissance and how that developed thereafter. And of course, my initial book was about tracing the role of Neoplatonic metaphysics in the thought of Aquinas, and each chapter begins with a little quote from Pico, and that's really because I was indebted to his work for getting me thinking about that role. I was a sort of very doctrinaire Aristotelian until I started reading Pico and Ficino, um, and actually that didn't cause me to abandon my Aristotelianism. It just simply kind of enriched it.
Let
So,
me interrupt you for a moment because
mm,
because but don't lose the train of thought. We'll come back to it. So anyone listening to us will think pretentious moi. Two very pretentious people have got together to show off their esoteric knowledge of Renaissance philosophy, and they might be right, but they're also very badly wrong because one of the reasons you wrote your book, Mysticism, Magic, and Monasteries, was out of a conviction that we suffered from uh, the shackles or the blinkers of a modern mind. And most people, it's like the question: whoever first discovered the water, we can be sure it wasn't the fish. Most of the people we live amongst won't know they have a modern mind, but they do. And just in brackets, I've been describing myself as a Neoplatonist for some time, and thinking I was making a fool of myself, and that people would imagine I was showing off. But I was grasping after something that you've described very clearly in your book, and so one of the reasons for having the conversation is I'm hoping you can describe it to people who have a modern mind and don't know it. That our civilization is having trouble because of the way in which we've bifurcated spirit and matter.
mm,
So when you talk about being an Aristotelian as well as a Platonist, you're echoing something you said in your book, which was that our culture is either too Aristotelian in the way it treats matter, or too Platonic in the way it elevates spirit, and what we're looking for is some kind of integration. So ready, steady, go. You tell it how it is.
well, it's interesting that you've introduced the word bifurcationism, which is obviously a word used in relation to Rene Descartes, and I think Descartes is, in many respects, the key culprit in this story. I'm writing a research monograph at the moment, and the opening chapters of that monograph are on really what we mean by the um, 17th century scientific revolution. And of course, we're very familiar with the effects of the scientific revolution because the effects were political and social, um, and they gave us the French Revolution, and they gave us the democratic age, and they gave us secular politics, and all of that sort of thing. But there was a prior history there. One of the reasons why Joseph de Maistre, for example, who was one of the great critics of the French Revolution, um, thought it was necessary to go back and write an entire book on Francis Bacon. It was precisely because he saw the foundations of our political and moral settlement in the modern age to be rooted in a whole load of prejudices and assumptions that go back to the century before the 18th century in the scientific revolution. And Descartes is a key figure here because Descartes obviously divides reality into two realities that only have a kind of accidental rather than a substantial relationship with one another, and those realities are what he called the res extensa and the res cogitans, and essentially the interior world of meaning and purpose and our own interior sense of personal identity, um, and then the external world of stuff, of things extended in matter, the extended thing, as he called it.
And so what you've done is you've laid out two areas of reference and no triangulation. So my understanding of the problem with Descartes is the only place of reference is the internal thought and thinker. And one of the things you do in your book is you complain about stuff. Stuff almost becomes a technical word, because what we've done is we've sucked out the perichoresis, isn't that the patristic word for interpenetration? We've sucked out the interpenetration of matter and spirit, and we've turned the stuff into stuff, and spirit we split off from. And so we've got this kind of, we're suffering from a kind of schizophrenia, which is the sin or the sickness of modernity. And I was so excited when you again articulated so much better than I can the idea that monasteries may be the answer to it all, because in the monastic life they brought the stuff and the spirit together again. Can you tell us about the stuff and why it matters that we should identify it as that, and what's wrong with this bifurcation and schizophrenia?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remain with this notion of bifurcationism for a moment, and then kind of entertain what the solution might be. So, with what develops in the 17th century in particular is this notion that everything of our experience is actually composed of sort of scentless, colorless, tasteless atomic structures. And most of the great thinkers of the scientific revolution, particularly Galileo Galilei, who was emphatic about the fact that this is how reality is best understood, thought that they were introducing a new novel ontology into the world, and that uh, the fruit of it would be scientific progress. But of course, what they were actually doing was introducing a very old ontology into the
Mm.
world, which Wolfgang Smith, the philosopher, the important philosopher and critic of scientism, often used to point out that this is a view of the world that is associated with Democritus in the ancient world, and actually, we might be able to say that the whole of Western intellectual history can very crudely, or very yes, crudely be called a kind of battle between the disciples of Democritus and the disciples of Pythagoras, in a way.
Mm.
You know, that those who completely level the universe and see the world simply as quantity, the reign of quantity, as René Guénon put it, and that we simply um, impose through psychological projection qualities onto the world that actually are nothing but fantasies. And Democritus even said this specifically in one of his fragments that we still have, that when you taste food, actually you're projecting the taste onto, because of course actually all you've got in your mouth are atoms, tasteless, colorless, scentless atoms. So this is a very old view, and then you've got a Pythagorean view, which is that no, the whole universe is the way it is because it participates in the creative act of the divine mind, and by so doing so, it discloses the divine mind to us, and that's not just simply how it looks, but also the way it smells, the way it tastes,
Mm.
the magnificent colors and everything. So it's it's the difference between a completely mechanistic and leveled conception of the universe and an iconographic, dare I say, enchanted conception of the universe. And
Can
the
I,
and Yeah, sorry, Gavin. Go
No,
ahead.
I want to ask. Well, a question's come up, and it's such an important one to me that I don't want to lose it at the risk of stopping your flow. But my guess is that you'll be able to refine your flow, and I may not refine the question. So, um, it's marvelous that you've singled out Democritus and Pythagoras. You've got this fantastic quote about music as well being an example of the way in which divinity is experienced as penetrating the universe. But the thing I was going to ask you was that uh, if we take the via affirmativa and the via negativa, the via one being about renunciation and slipping, maximizing the life of the spirit, and the via affirmativa being the kind of Christian artistic view, which very much takes up what you've just been talking about, that matter resonates, is impregnated with the presence of God. Um, in some of my reading, the monasteries are blamed for pursuing the via negativa too much as a kind of kudos in, I mean, obviously amongst people who love St. John of the Cross, but generally speaking, the renunciation, the being celibate instead of thanking God for making love, fasting instead of being immensely grateful for day in day out for the food. That the monasteries fell into the via negativa and in a way gave it the kind of a superior spirituality sense amongst Christians in the West. So there's that which I've read and thought about and don't quite. I mean, that's terribly primitive. I'm hoping you'll flesh it out a bit. But there's the fact that quite rightly you then say, as I've thought, that recovering monastic life may be absolutely integral to reclaiming Christendom, if only because, well, without monasteries, we devalue the life of the spirit. Where is it incarnated? Amongst whom is it incarnated? I've been, again, footnote, I've been terribly impressed as I was reading up on Thomas à Becket about the way in which it was the monastic communities that really made the impact in Kent, especially from
Mm.
597 onwards. It was the monasteries and the monks that the rulers were blown away by and say, my goodness, these people are really very sophisticated, powerful, and immense. They're the most resourced people we've ever met, and therefore we need to take Christianity seriously. Can you help me, in the context of the conversation we're having, know where to place the monasteries on either the via negativa, renunciation is king, or the via affirmativa, the proper Pythagorean antidote to Descartes, integration of matter and spirit? How do I do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. Certainly, there's always this tension within Christianity that the ancients, the patristic conception of creation is that it does disclose something of the creator, and yet at the same time, insofar as it is indeed creation, there is an infinite difference between the creation and the creator, who infinitely transcends it. So in the end, we have to go through that kind of spiritual ascent through the created order to God, but that is precisely to constantly recognize that um, the that that God always transcends the created order, and therefore, in some way, union with God entails a kind of detachment. And what Christianity does, and I don't think you can really talk about this in direct propositional in a direct propositional sense. One of the things that's quite interesting about Christianity is that um, discursive theology tends to give way as it becomes more and more refined. It tends to give way to mystical theology, and the whole Christian tradition has always insisted that mystical theology is a higher species of theology
Mm,
to discursive theology, and yet mystical theology is best communicated in poetry and art and so on.
mm,
So it's almost like this stuff evades a propositional way of talking or exploring these difficult questions. But all I would say is this: um, if you actually look at the history of monasticism, particularly in the West, what you get is um, this wonderful interplay between the ascetic life of renunciation and detachment and the absolute treasuring of created goods
mm,
as great gifts of God. So it's the monasteries who are developing ascetical mystical theology and what's required for penance and mortification and the atonement of sins and so on. And yet it's the monasteries who are brewing the beer and making the wine and commissioning artisans to do great masterpieces of art, of sculpture, of great architectural masterpieces. So there's this and I think actually this is how we should best understand the Christian spiritual life in many ways, through the metaphor of play. There is this playfulness going on between these two aspects. I think for the time being that's the best I can do.
Oh no,
In
that's
answer.
lovely. The play and perhaps even dance.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
that's that. Well, that's very helpful. Apart from anything else, I was my categories were a bit too blunt, but you're right. Um, just take us back a bit more to discursive and mystical theology. In your book, you're quite rude about mysticism per se, and I think one of the reasons you're rude about it is because you suspect that, rightly, I think that people give a priority to the detached spiritual sort of kudos or status, and but actually, if interpenetration is the right model, you can't have mysticism without matter. Mysticism's got to be somehow rooted in matter, and matter's got to be seen or experienced or handled in mysticism. And this is one of the reasons why it's so annoying to have this debate with ecologists, because they're absolutely convinced that matter is sacred without it being interpenetratively accountable to the creator, but almost in a gnostic way that matter has some sacred value of its own. And so when you try as a Christian to say to the ecologist, look, we don't need to worship this stuff or to set it up as a new prime value, because it's already found its place in the love and the service of God who made it, and we're already charged with a responsibility to love it and to find God in it without turning it into God. And if we can't recover that interpenetration, there's no way in which we can find a moral platform to saying to the ecologists who are all scared out of their minds, of course, look, you've gone too far and in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm rude about mysticism per se. What I am very skeptical of is, um, well, as you put it, not a Gnostic or Manichaean mysticism that sees the spiritual life as in some way an emancipation from our embodied condition. And I think that the commingling of Christianity with, I would say, a certain inordinate anthropological dualism imported from Oriental mysticism in the last century has, played merry hell with the Christian mystical tradition in some ways. So what I'm trying to do. I mean, there are basically only two aspects to almost everything I write. I just um, regurgitate the same two ideas in different ways. And those
Most of us only have one idea that we regurgitate. So having two, you're way ahead of the rest of us.
those two notions are: one, the reintegration of the human person as a single substance of um, spirit and matter, um, and two, the theophany of the created order. Those are the two key ideas to pretty much everything I write, and those two ideas are without a doubt um, probably the two most offensive ideas I can think of to the Gnostic conception of the world. So, Gnosticism has, particularly in its Manichaean form, has traditionally seen uh, um, spiritual liberty or liberation as emancipation from our embodied condition, and a lot of commentators have noted that this seems to be coming back in popular culture through the LGBTQ movement and various aspects of extreme leftism. Um, And also,
Stop, stop. Just off a moment,
yes.
because that's so interesting, and I don't want to lose it. Um, I think it'd be very so. And what you've done, it seems to me, is you've expressed hesitation about the new fashion of identity politics being located in certain sexual preferences. And whenever the church talks about that, people usually say, you're just homophobic, you're frightened of your own bodies, you don't, you Christians don't understand sex, and you're really prejudiced. But actually, just for a moment, I think what you're about to do is to give us an intellectual, the wrong word, give us a philosophical take, which, if understood, is self-evidently nothing to do with homophobia. It's to do with saying, look, you're making a category error of thought, and this category error of thought is what's led you into what is, in fact, a sterile cul-de-sac of sexuality. Hang on. So here we go. Right. Well, I'm sorry about that break. But so I was asking you to save us from the charge of homophobia by suggesting that the critique you were offering was that actually the whole issue of sexual politics and a preference for expressing our identity in terms of sterile, non-fertile options that have nothing to do with heterosexuality is actually a category error, not something that doesn't emerge from us being afraid of our bodies or afraid of sex. We're not phobic in any way. We just think that people have taken a wrong intellectual turning somewhere. Can you expand on that?
Well, I mean, it just seems to me that the so-called LGBTQ plus movement. I mean, I don't want to sort of dwell on this topic for too long, but just
Be as brief as you like.
yeah, just in passing, it seems to me that it is contingent upon what's essentially a Cartesian or anthropologically dualistic assumption, which is that I have this internal self, who is my authentic self, who cannot be disclosed to you, whom you don't know, because myself, my inner identity, actually only has an accidental relationship with my body, which is something
Right.
else. It
Right.
is the vehicle that transports my authentic self around, and the flourishing of my body and the correct use of my body has absolutely nothing to do with the emancipation and liberty and self-realization of my true inner authentic self. And that's why that it's very popular at the moment, particularly among certain conservatives, to say, well, we shouldn't talk about the LGBTQ community because the L's and the G's have nothing to do with the T's, because one is a sexual a sexual appetite and identity, and the other is a kind of much wider anthropological claim. And it may be true insofar as the claim of the T's takes the claim of the L's and the G's to the most extreme possible extrapolation. But actually, the claim is structurally the same. The claim is that the the that the telos of the body and its particular organs cannot tell us anything about the
Mm.
flourishing of the inner internal authentic self. And that is an anthropological claim which I simply reject,
Mm.
because um, I am at root a hylomorphist, which is a pompous way of saying that I think that each human being is one thing, that we're not ghosts in machines.
Mm.
The I simply reject the largely unexamined and often inarticulated anthropological claim on which that whole movement is based. Um, so, uh, I mean, if that means that I am going to be charged with homophobia, for example, then then so be it. But I'd much rather not sort of get into a situation in which people are ideologically throwing slogans at each other, and instead have a kind of mature conversation about what sort of anthropological claims we think are feasible and which ones aren't.
But it's a bit as if the whole "you've been assigned at birth school" are saying, well, here comes a baby. I can see the baby's body, but inside the baby's body, there's a brain in the skull. And the brain in the skull may be an entirely different gender or sex orientation from the rest of its body. And so, since we can't do any brain transplants or know it by now, we'll just let it muck around with the body with surgery and hormones later on, in order to make the body align better with the integrity of whatever it was in the skull, as if the idea that there could be a kind of person in the middle of a skull, very Cartesian, split off from the body, with its own sexual preference, is totally independent of the purpose for which they were born. They use the telos is the key, isn't it? There isn't any way of separating who we are unless you're a passionate implicit Cartesian from the whole thing. We're just a whole, and if bits of the whole break off from the rest of it and set the appetite at war with the hormones or the genitals, then that's dis-ease. That's a very
Yeah.
strong way of being unwell with yourself.
Yeah, indeed. And it means that as a civilization, there are certain key concepts that we lose that, well, for example, in the last 10 years, probably, we've actually lost the concept that doing violence to healthy parts of the body falls under a particular definition called mutilation. And
Mm.
civilized societies don't mutilate people, certainly not children. Um, so we've actually lost certain key moral concepts by which we actually build a civilized settlement together. So it's not unserious that
Yeah.
this is going on, and I suppose I do lament the fact that a more dispassionate, disinterested conversation about what kind of anthropologies we're prepared to work with um, hasn't taken place, but maybe it will in the near future as more and more horror stories emerge. Now, how all of this relates to the question of monasticism, it's going to be difficult to see how I tie it together. But here's one way. Um, what monasticism does is it absolutely prioritizes and privileges the notion of embodied spirituality. A monastery is built to be in a particular place, not for a decade or even a century, but for millennia. Um, you know, monasticism in the history of our country has been absolutely extraordinary. Just yesterday, I spent the whole day walking around Glastonbury, for example. You walk through the great abbey there that was sacked at the Reformation, that was for a long time the largest monastery in England, and you get a sense of just what that town would have been um, under its monastic settlement, with constantly the mass being offered, the chanting of psalms, incense rising up to the heavens, processions going through the towns, the blessings of all the fields going on. I mean, that is real, incarnated, embodied spirituality, and that's very much what we've lost. I mean, the most incarnational spirituality often gets today is kind of going to your local IKEA and buying a decorative Buddha statue for your sitting room or something. That's embodied spirituality today. So we've completely lost this sense, and I think we've lost it largely because we've all been duped by the Cartesian um, fable that actually um, such things just serve as a reminder of the spiritual life, because actually the spiritual life simply has nothing to do with this external world of stuff that just isn't implicated in spiritual transformation. And that's just these just all mark a whole set of assumptions that I just reject. I simply reject them.
I want to
Um,
ask you about re-enchantment in a moment. Before I do,
mm,
I'm going to indulge myself and ask you to come with me in terms of the Catholic character of the country that was lost when they went after the monasteries. I can't think of Glastonbury without thinking of the elderly abbot whom they hung from what remains of the tour because he refused to accept the claims of the state over the city of man, over the city of God. And my heart breaks. I feel tears coming when I think of what he gave. The courage of the man. There were a few abbots that did this. But as I look back at at the history of our country, and you like me are an Englishman, I've really only discovered my Englishness since becoming a Catholic, which is odd because what I was propagandized into as an Anglican and a member of the establishment was sort of 400 or 500 years of what's turned out to be a failed experiment. It's failed in me, but it's not just in me. It's failed. It's generally failed, and I like writing about its failure in order to try and wake people up. But what I'm upset about is the way in which the state looked at monasticism and decided that it was going to destroy it, not just for greed, though that was part of it, or for authoritarianism, though that was also part of it, but as a way of doing life, precisely at the moment when the scientific revolution started and the danger of splitting off how and why emerged into our culture. And one of the things I want to do with the time that I've got left is to say to my co-propagandized, we made a terrible mistake in the 16th century, and one of the reasons why so much is under threat in terms of civilization and human rights and decent morals and ethics, and is because we took this terrible turn. And when you look at what the state did in the 16th century, not just to the abbot of Glastonbury, but to all the people who clung to the mass, and clinging to the mass is not just a token of nostalgia. The mass itself is the integrated paradigm for everything we've been talking about. And the state decided it was going to get rid of the mass and destroy that paradigm, introduced the bifurcation of stuff and thought. The idea that you could somehow make God present by wanting him to be so rather than allowing him. Well, let's also talk about the proper definition of the supernatural. So two things. First of all, this dreadful period is much more nefarious than the people we live amongst allow because of propaganda. Secondly, in the time that's left, briefly about a proper Catholic understanding of the supernatural. You look to orthodoxy as doing a slightly better job, but nonetheless, the way in which we understand it is hugely important. And thirdly, I suppose, the Dreher thing came out at the same time as you did. You're both talking about the same thing. How we deal with the loss of enchantment and re-enchant ourselves, and maybe we can slip in McGilchrist at some point if it's appropriate. But anyway, so three very big things to manage in not a very long amount of time.
Well, I think a good way into this would be just picking up what you said a moment ago about only really discovering your own Englishness since becoming a Catholic. You're right to intuit that this is far from unique to you. This happens to people all the time. When they become Catholic, they also discover their nationhood and their patriotism at the same time. And I think there's a reason for that that's quite important, and it's connected to the relationship between the natural and the supernatural. And then it's namely this, that prior to the establishment of the church, it's not that people were secular, right? The myth of secularism is something created in the last few centuries. People were deeply, profoundly religious, and religiosity marked their entire conception of meaning making and what the world actually is, and the drama in which they found themselves. The question is, who was the appropriate authority over the religious life of any given people prior to the establishment of the church? Well, the answer was the temporal ruler. That was the case in Aztec society. That was the case in Roman society. It didn't matter where you looked. It was the priests of any given society, those who offered sacrifice, were always the servants of the temporal ruler, who was the final arbiter in all religious affairs. But with the incarnation, supernatural religion, the religion of God's own divine life that enables us to share in the charity of the triune Godhead, has flooded the world. And so the temporal ruler simply is not the apposite or appropriate authority over um, the over supernatural religion, given that he's a temporal ruler. Now, once baptized, he has a share in religious governance, but what you need is an institution of purely supernatural origin in order to teach and disseminate this new supernatural religion that has flooded the world by means of the incarnation. Now, that institution we call the church. So when Henry VIII said, well, actually, no, the temporal ruler is going to be the final arbiter over religious matters in this kingdom, he wasn't actually creating a new settlement. What he was doing was he was re-establishing the order of things according to the pre-Christian settlement. It was actually what Henry VIII was doing was, perhaps we should say unwittingly, he was establishing the old pagan settlement.
Yeah.
And we've had to suffer the consequences of that now for 5 centuries. Now, when you become a Catholic, and so you become fully enmeshed in the great story of supernatural religion flooding the world, what you suddenly realize is that the role of this supernatural institution is to take possession through charity of the nations of the world and thereby make disciples of them. And so suddenly, what your nation is and the role you have in the church's mission in discipling that nation becomes absolutely essential. And I see this with people all the time. So you know, a Spaniard who is raised in a secular family and has a poor religious education and is badly catechized or whatever, and then suddenly has a conversion later in life and starts going to mass and reading his catechism and praying his rosary and so on, he becomes doubly Spanish, right? And he becomes intensely Spanish. Because he realizes that his Spanishness is absolutely integral to his mission. That happens with everybody. And that's actually a very good thing. It's why Catholics make exemplary patriots, and they tend to foster the civil life and duties and obligations and pieties. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah, the role of monasticism in the establishment of this kingdom was an extraordinary thing. Something I often remind people is that even the actual shape of the country itself was formed by monasticism. That it was the Cistercians who were, of course, some may argue, the only English order that still exists, because whilst St. Bernard was the great fomenter of the Cistercian order, it was St. Stephen Harding, an Englishman, who really founded the Cistercian reform. And the Cistercians did very well in England. And one of the places they went to was the what we call the Wash, the estuary around where Huntingdonshire and Lincolnshire and Norfolk all meet. And they drained that whole area and extended it right into the sea, and so which is the shape of England to this day. So even the very shape of our island testifies to the extraordinary role of monasticism here. We really are a monastic island, and I think we won't really ever fully know who we are as a people until we start to recover some of that. So
Let me
yes,
ask you
please.
very briefly then too about the natural and the supernatural, because a lot of a lot of people imagine that when one becomes a traditional Catholic and one says, well, one of the exciting things about this is there's a miracle at Mass every Sunday, and then the relics of the saints cause miracles, and the life of sanctity produces miracles. One enters into a kind of largesse of supernaturalism that people with a modern mind misunderstand as either fundamentalism or some kind of form of superstitious stupidity. But actually, it's predicated upon the perichoresis of stuff and spirit. It's the proper balance. It's the proper integration. It's the real economy. It's what works best and well. Can you talk a bit about some of the parodies of the way in which people understand the supernatural, particularly from people don't expect intellectuals, or in my case, aspiring intellectuals, to be comfortable with the supernatural. They think it ought to be beneath us.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is the way that supernatural as a word is used in popular culture today. So, you'll often go into bookshops on the high street, and there'll even be a category supernatural, and you'll look underneath, and it will be about things like ghost hunting, or how to organize your own seance or something and conjure up your dead uncle or whatever it is. The way that we use the word has really nothing to do with the theological use of the word, which supernature is simply what Saint Peter in his first letter describes as partaking in the divine nature of God. That's all supernature is. Um, we have the natural, we have created nature, we have uncreated supernature, which is God, and we have created supernature, which is the way he shares his life with us, which is grace, which is the redemption of nature, and drawing it up into himself, to share in his own communion of love. And that's all we really mean by the supernatural. Now, this should it should make perfect sense to us as to why he would want to do this with his creation, once we have a good baptized Neoplatonic metaphysics. Because for people like you and me, Gavin, I think there is no such thing as stuff. That's the
Right.
point. There's no such
Yeah.
thing as stuff. The um, uh, in classical Christian metaphysics, matter is pure potency. Okay, it's real, but it doesn't exist. Okay, it doesn't exist until it is in reception of a form. So matter can only exist as something. It can't simply exist as matter. It has to be the matter of this dog or that table or that tree. And so matter is always pure potency until it's brought into being by the reception of the forms, and the forms are the created essences that are brought into being from the mind of God, which means that the whole of the universe is the incarnation
Mm,
of God's mind,
mm,
right? That's what the universe is. And it's very important that we realize that, because that's the highway, that's the escape
mm.
route out of the
The
um
modern mind.
the great lie of stuff. Yeah, the
Mm,
modern mind's lie of stuff. You know, there is no such thing as stuff. What you have found yourself embroiled in is the incarnation of the divine mind. Okay, that's
right.
what the cosmos is. And so the great tragedy, according to the biblical narrative, is that through our own disobedience and through our own infidelity towards God, what we've done is we've placed the incarnation of the divine mind under the jurisdiction of the devil, right? Which
Mm,
is the worst thing we could have ever done, and we went and did it, right?
yeah.
And so, uh, what is remarkable is not so much that God has incarnated in history, because the church fathers said he was always going to do that, because he loves us so much that he wants to be personally present to us. What's amazing is that God incarnated in history despite the fact that we placed the whole of history under the incarnation of Satan. he still came, and he used the opportunity to save us, and he knew that we were gonna, if he did this, that we were gonna murder him, and that he was going to use that event to draw us into the communion of love with himself. Right? I mean, it's really quite. When one puts it in those terms, that I think is just sufficient for a lifetime of contemplation.
Well,
And so,
can I just add something very
sorry,
briefly before we get forward?
please,
Otherwise,
yeah,
I'll lose it.
no,
Just
please.
well, so the way you've described this makes the incarnation almost natural rather than aberrational. So
Hmm.
in my mind, I've always had to make a special pleading for the incarnation, suffering from the modern mind, because why would pure spirit take on stuff and clothe himself with stuff? And of course, it's precisely that notion that gives us heretical views of what and who Jesus was, the relationship between spirit and the stuff he did or didn't clothe himself in. But the way you've described it, with energy and matter, if you like, uh, acting or on tiptoe as potential agency for the divine, to be reformed in whatever pattern God's love was pleased to do, makes the whole of what was stuff simply um, an amenable extension of the Godhead, because as you quite rightly said earlier on, the universe is a form of incarnation already.
Hmm.
And that this wonderful idea that, I mean, St. Paul warns us this is going to be the case when he says that um, the whole, oh, it's St. John, I'm so sorry, the whole of the universe holds together in him. It
Hmm.
subsists in him. The matter is not separate from him. It's a, I don't know if emanation is a safe word, but it's an emanation of him already. And what's going to happen is he's going to format it and tweak it in a way that allows the divine mind and the infused matter a particular functional and symbolic and symbiotic expression. So the incarnation, but this is so much more of a natural, easy, logical is the wrong word, consistent expression of the mind of God and matter, as opposed to what I always found I was struggling with, which is pure spirit and pure matter, oil and water. Don't really see how they can mix together without some kind of tension in the head.
Yeah, which is that's an unnecessary dichotomy, and
Right,
it doesn't fit well into classical Christian metaphysics. Once we realize that the universe is actually the incarnation of the divine mind, or if you want to put it this way, the incarnation, the universe is the incarnation of the divine logos. Then what we realize is that the moment of the Annunciation is the completion of the cosmos.
right. Oh,
Right.
that's lovely. That's beautiful.
So
Absolutely. Yes, right. Beautiful. Very
so
good.
that's yeah. Anyway, there you go. That's all of that.
So we should stop. We should stop there because that's just such a fantastic climax. We're very high on the mountain, uh, and where do you go from there? Look, we've spoken for an hour. It's so kind of you to do this. Thank you very
No,
much.
not at all. It's a great
And
pleasure.
I've it's been so nice when I opened the pages of your book and discovered you've called your dog Pico. I thought we're onto a winner here. Wonderful.
Well,
Sebastian, thank
it's
you.
interesting. I mean, you just one final point about your wariness about using the word emanation. Um, a few people have said to me, "Look, you do be careful with this word because it evokes origin and people who perhaps you want to steer clear from." But I think it's very important to recover this word in question 45 of the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. He asks himself the question, what is creation? And when he comes to answer this question, he uses the word emanation 7 times in a single paragraph. Emanation participation metaphysics is absolutely at the heart of a Christian ontology, and I think it's essential if we're going to get out of the Galilean Cartesian, leveled, Baconian, modern cosmology, and actually recover the cosmos of theophany, then we have to be courageous enough to use a word like emanation, which really does denote the right relation between creation and the creator. And given that Aquinas himself deploys it, we shouldn't be too worried about using that word. You know, as long as we're using it in the right way. So as he did. So that's I would just that's my little defense of the word emanation. Anyway,
Fantastic, wonderful PS, and I received the absolution gladly. Sebastian, I wonder if we might even be able to do this again in some other form. There's so much in there that needs unpacking, and as you say, you have two ideas which you constantly repackage, and that is so much more impressive than the rest of us who only managed to regurgitate one. Thank you very much. It's been such fun and really lovely to be able to talk to you like this. Thank you.
thanks for having me. Thank you.